Слово надається пану Еріку Райнеру.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I have to say first of all that I'm not an expert on pensions, but I come from a country which has a similar system as Chile, except that it's run by the government and it's not individualized. But I think Mr. Arthur has a good point, which is that the system has been pay as you go. The system has been that the current working generation is paying for those who no longer work. And that system works very well as long as the economy is growing, as long as the demographics are smooth. You know, that works very well. And the Norwegian pension fund has been doing similar things. They behaved like a capitalist. So they've been doing similar things to the Chilean fund, but as I say, owned by the state. And of course, if it's owned by the state, there is a guarantee for a downside. You know, if there is a huge economic crisis, well, if this is run by the state, you assume that the state is will guarantee. And when we found oil, the income from the government, which from the oil exploration, which is huge, was added to the government pension fund, and it's called Government Pension Fund Abroad. You know, that's the oil business, because the previous, the original pension fund was used to finance economic development in Norway, right? So you do have a trade-off here, and this is a trade-off which will be important for the Ukraine. You know, on the one hand, you want to use your pension funds to develop your own infrastructure and your own industry. On the other hand, you want to diversify it in the interest of the pensioners. So this is an important trade-off. You know, on one hand, you want to diversify as much as possible in order to safeguard the investment. On the other hand, you want this to be a tool of economic development. And I think here in the Ukraine, it should be used as a tool of development, but with the economic risks coming with that, I would say that perhaps it's a good idea that it's owned by the government. You know, the less stable the economy, the more risky it is to have a private solution, I think. And all the former Soviet republics, I think most of them have a problem with, I know in the Baltic states anyway, that the birth rate fell in the 1990s, so you have a demographic bump, which adds to the problem. And what also adds to the problem today is, of course, that in the early 2000s, you could get a real interest rate of 5 or 6% on the bond markets, right? So it was easy to finance pension funds. Pension funds were growing very fast, and now with the policies of Mr. Draghi, who is printing money equals printing debt, the interest rate is very low. It's even negative. You know, if you invest in bonds in Swiss francs, well, there's a negative interest rate. So this really adds to the problem of pension funds. And I think if we look at the pension fund situation in Europe over the last decades, clearly, let's say, in this case, the unions maybe had too much power. For instance, in a country like Italy, there was a legislation that if you had worked 25 years in a company, you had the right to a pension. So if you started at 15, you could retire at 40. Right? This was obviously exaggerated, and many Italian companies actually were closed down at the age of 25 because it was too expensive to keep the company alive. So they had to start a new company to at 24.5 years. So that was obviously not very constructive. And I think we also have to face the fact that as people are as they live longer, we cannot have all of that extra years of life as pensioners. So the pension age has to be regulated, and that's been a big problem, in France and all over the place. I think in Norway we had a pension reform not too long ago, and the pension age is now 67. And you find in many rich countries that people want to work. So the problem is, part of the problem is that people want to retire early. The other problem is that people don't want to retire. and an extreme case is the state of Massachusetts, where actually if you're a professor at Harvard, well, you can go on working as long as you want, right? There is no way that you can forcefully retire people. And to me, that's probably not a good idea either, especially because in difficult times, because you're not letting the young people into the labor market, right? So there are many dilemmas in the area of pensions. And I think even pensions can even become a matter of foreign policy. So if the minimum pension in Russia is 3 times that of the Ukraine, in the border areas, you can even imagine that pensions are a political issue, whether you want to live in Russia or the Ukraine. Well, of course, the cost of living is lower in the Ukraine, and I know in Estonia that many people who there's a big Russian population in Estonia. About a third of the inhabitants are of Russian origin, and many of them who get residence in and even passports in Estonia keep their Russian passports in order to get 2 pensions, right? So it's becoming an international issue as well. Well, I think I'll leave it there, presenting these kinds of problems and saying that, well, I think the Chilean system is very impressive, but you also have a problem. Well, what do you do, not pensions, but Social Security? What do you do if you have a lot of people who have been self-employed all their lives, small farmers, whatever? What do you do with them? And there's some problems there with where to set the limits for Social Security. I know in Georgia, if you have 1 cow, you don't receive state pension. So it's a disincentive for owning cows. But what you should really do is, of course, to have an incentive for people to own cows. So this whole area is extremely complicated, and we're mixing pension and Social Security, and I think we have to think about these things together. But the fact that pensions should be used to a large extent to finance local development, I think the Chilean case is very important. The question is, how much of that risk should you put on the individuals, and how much should the state absorb? I think both systems work, but I'm afraid that with the volatility and insecurity of the Ukrainian economy, maybe it's better that it's backed by the state. But it's like in industrial policy. The important thing is to have an industry, whether it's owned by the private or the state is secondary, really. But that you have a system which invests in industry, that's important. And it seems to me that the diversification, the foreign diversification that the Latin American pension funds had was very sensible. But it's a big problem in Norway. we have a situation where my generation is doing very well, but those who are 20 years younger than me, they will have a much smaller pension than I have. So it's not obvious that there are no obvious solutions here. Thank you.
Дякую, пане Райнер. Ви сказали про Національний пенсійний фонд Норвегії, він найбільший в світі серед пенсійних фондів. Скажіть, будь ласка, скільки йде інвестування в Норвегії і скільки за кордон? Які основні активи інвестує цей фонд?
Basically, the old pension fund was all invested domestically. But the extra oil money is all invested abroad. And I think too much is invested abroad. So I think Norway is underinvesting in infrastructure and in many things because they were too afraid of creating inflation at home. And they don't think that if you invest in infrastructure, you actually create deflation because the cost of transportation goes down. So I think the old pension fund in Norway worked really well.
Добре. Дякую.